Hello, I'm Pastor Donnie Gamble coming to you from Macedonia Baptist Church in Monroe, North Carolina. And this is our Wednesday Bible study for this week. We are currently in the Book of Esther, and we are going to be talking about what goes on in chapter 2. Chapter 2 I call Esther Rises in Popularity. We saw last week how the king became very angry at his queen Vashti, and we'll be talking about that a little bit. But the theme verse for this book is perhaps you were born for a time such as this, Esther 4:14. So I'm just going to read through these verses and make some comments. And I hope if you have questions that you would send those questions to me by email. And at the end of this presentation, my email address will be up there on the screen. And if you have questions, if you have comments, or just let me know you're taking part in this Bible study, I'd like to hear from you. So please do that. So in verse 1, it says, after these things. Now, the reason that's there is there's a purpose, because it's talking about the things of chapter 1. What happened in chapter 1? Well, King Ahasuerus got angry at his wife, his queen, Vashti. He summons her to come to his party, and this was a men's party. She was having a separate ladies' party, but he wanted to show her off. And I don't think she really wanted that to happen because she declined the invitation. She didn't come. Made him angry, and some fellows around him talked him into, well, just get rid of her. You don't need her. But here in verse 1 of chapter 2, we see it's telling us he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Perhaps, I'm just thinking, somewhere in his heart, he still had some feelings for Vashti, and as wicked as a king as he was, perhaps he had misgivings, or he was having second thoughts about what he had done against her. But he didn't have very long to consider this, because in verse 2 it says, then the king's servants who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Now, these servants, they were quick to come up with this suggestion, mainly, I believe, because if Queen Vashti came back to power and she knew of these servants and that they had encouraged the king from deposing her, then she could go after them. She could have them in prison. She could probably have them put to death. So they came up with this idea: let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom. Remember, there's 127 provinces, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the citadel, into the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. In verse 5, it says, in Shushan the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. In other words, Mordecai was a Jew. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah. Now that was her Persian name. That is Esther. That's her Jewish name. His uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful when her father and mother died. So here we have a relative by the name of Mordecai. He's a very important part of the book of Esther. He's a very important person in the life of Esther. He's always looking after her best interest. He's also a man that seems to have spiritual wisdom. And so it's good that Esther has Mordecai in her life. Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace, into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. In reading about this, there were several palaces. The king had a lot of palaces, and there was one palace where all the young virgins were kept. And then there was a palace where the other servant girls who were not virgins, they were kept there in that palace. And as I say, Queen Vashti, she had her own palace, and of course the king had his palace, and he had more than one palace that he lived in during the year. So Shushan the citadel, and Haggai is the one in charge of looking after these women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor. I did a little word study on that. She pleased him, and in other words, he saw her as very beautiful. He literally had an eye for her. The Hebrew word for eye shows up there in the definition of that word. She was pleasing to the eye, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. So here you see this Jewish teenager. She's a teenager. When she's described in the Hebrew language as an adolescent, a young teenager. And all these women were young teenagers. Just think about that. But yeah, this story is in God's Word, and it's in a book where God's sovereign purposes are definitely carried out. So it was just the way things were done many times in the courts of pagan kings. So these maidservants were provided for her, and she was moved, it says. Verse 10, Esther had not revealed her people or family. The lineage, she had the same lineage as Mordecai. She had not revealed that. She did not reveal that she was a Jew, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. He was protecting her. Verse 11, and every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Now it was the women's quarters. Naturally, Mordecai couldn't go in there. He couldn't just go in there and ask for Esther and ask her if she was okay. So he was like a nervous hen. He just paced back and forth at the gate and just worried about what was happening to her. Verse 12, each young woman's turn came to go into King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months preparation, according to the regulations for the women. And for thus were the days of their preparation apportioned, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. So it was a 12-month makeover. But these women were already beautiful. Verse 13, thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who kept the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. And in verse 15, now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. In other words, she just went in there on her own merit. She didn't need any other help. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. In other words, he declared a holiday much like our Christmas, and he was the gift giver. He was a happy man, no doubt. He had found a substitute queen. But what was actually happening, God was behind the scenes in his sovereign power, and he was providing a way for this young Jewish girl to be right there next to the king, a wicked king, a pagan king. Nevertheless, she's going to be in his court, and she's going to be an influencer of this king. And it's really going to turn out to be a very beautiful story of how God's people are going to be rescued and preserved through the actions of this young teenage lady. And we're just going to continue to go through this and see the hand of God moving. When the virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. So it's very, very good that Esther respected Mordecai and listened to Mordecai, because Mordecai was concerned about her and wanted to take care of her. Also, this helped the Lord to fulfill his purpose through Esther. Verse 21, in those days while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, what names, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So here we have a very big event, because when Mordecai learns of this conspiracy going on between these two doorkeepers, then for whatever reason they were wanting to come against the king, they just wanted to overthrow him. And when Mordecai heard of this, he tells Esther. Esther tells the king in Mordecai's name. In other words, I received this from Mordecai. So it was investigated. It was confirmed. They were hung on the gallows, and it was recorded in the King's Chronicles. So this one thing, this one act, is really going to project Queen Esther in the king's mind, that she's favorable to him. She's concerned about him. She shares information of a possible overthrow attempt. So this is going to gain favor in the king's eyes for Esther as we go along. And of course, Esther 4:14, perhaps you were born for a time such as this. This young Jewish girl was born for such a time as she was living. And we need to remember in our own lives, God has a plan for each of us, and he wants to work through us, and he wants to use us. And what we need to do is do what Esther did. She made herself available. Mordecai made himself available for the things he did. And we need to do the same. I want to invite you to come Sunday, June 13th, this coming Sunday, for worship. We're going to continue to be in the Book of Acts. And we're just getting started with this study, and we're going to be seeing how the acts of the Holy Spirit are running through the Book of Acts. So make time to come and be with God's people and worship and learn. So as I said earlier, if you'd like to contact me, here's my email address, and I would love to hear from you. You may have a prayer request. Please send that out to us if you have that. And we will definitely share that with the church.